It's time now for perspective. If you were pressed to think of the most significant turning points in the history of 21st century Britain, you might opt for the end of World War II in 1945 or possibly 1979 with the election of Margaret Thatcher. But what about 1962? It may not have been a year of major geopolitical significance, but for my guest today, it was 1962 that marked the start of a seismic shift in the way the country defined itself. David Kynaston is the author of the recently published On the Cusp, Days of 62. Thank you so much for joining us today. What exactly was it that led you to believe that this one year was so significant in the social and cultural history of the United Kingdom?
Well, there was just one moment really, and obviously, change evolves slowly and gradually, even in the 1960s, the semi-mythical 1960s. But it was a remarkable fact that on one single day, Friday, 5th of October, 62, not only did the first Beatles single, "Love Me Do," was released, but the first James Bond film, Dr. No, was premiered. And if one's thinking about icons of the 60s, Beatles, James Bond, they're pretty high on anybody's list. Obviously, society didn't just change overnight. And of course, it's a very good question, how much anyway did society change through the 1960s? I was at university in the 1970s, and a friend from the north of England used to say to me, I can tell you this, the 60s never happened in Blackburn. Blackburn was an industrial city in Lancashire. And, for Blackburn, probably read many other places. We have images of London, King's Road, Carnaby Street, and so on, but they're not necessarily representative. So the challenge for the social historian, as ever for any historian, is to get that balance right between change and continuity. But something did happen in the 60s, and it's for the sake of argument, really. But it seemed to me that 5th of October 62, with the Beatles and Bond, was as good a line in the sand as any.
And I'd like to talk a little more about the Beatles. Love Me Do, an iconic single, doesn't necessarily today feel particularly revolutionary. Was it?
Well, at the time, it was quite revolutionary. Actually, I've just got a sort of the dimmest of memories of it. With the sort of, I was 11, with that very sort of strong sort of harmonica and slightly sort of bluesy feel to it. It was a time when the charts were still dominated very much by solo singers, often singing rather sort of sentimental, slushy ballads and so on. And there was some sort of raw energy to Love Me Do, actually, that was different from what was around, and the whole kind of beat scene and so on. And then the Rolling Stones really came along next year, 63, and presented themselves as the kind of anti-Beatles, really. So it was the energy really that was different. It was a kind of young people saying, "Hey, something different's coming."
And how much, carrying on from what you just said, how much was the influence a musical one, and how much was it something more? Because of course we have the sexual revolution in the 60s. To what extent do you think that sort of music really, set the groundwork for what came later?
Well, it provided in every way the sort of soundtrack and so on. You mentioned the sexual revolution. The really interesting thing is that for women, there were actually the changes came relatively slowly, and the next wave of women's liberation didn't really come until the 1970s. And actually, a survey that was done in the early 1970s of sort of sexual mores and habits and behaviour and so on, showed that remarkably, across the population as a whole, remarkably little in terms of, say, extramarital relations, remarkably little had changed in the 60s compared to the 50s. So these things do evolve slowly, but gradually it happens. And I suppose a classic example is if you think about single-sex relations. At the start of this time, 1962, it was still illegal. It was a criminal offence to engage in homosexual relations, however consensual. But that changed in the course of the 60s, and then, of course, over the next 40 or 50 years, things went further, and we got to the point of single-sex marriage and so on. But it all takes time.
And was there a parallel then with sexual mores with race relations? How were race relations in the early 60s in the UK? Was there a pushback against the kind of easy racist tropes that were so prevalent in 50s advertising, for example?
Well, there was a pushback, and legislation came in that in the course of the 60s that not only legislated against discrimination but also racist behaviour and so on. But there was an awful lot of racism about in the 60s and 70s, and certainly when Enoch Powell, British conservative politician, made in 1968 his famous speech in Birmingham, in which he predicted, in effect, predicted sort of mass bloodshed and civil unrest and so on if immigration continued to grow. He struck a real chord with many people. So it's been a story. It seems to me. I think there has been. We still got problems. I mean, obviously there was the episode just after the Euros final when the three young black guys who missed the penalties, got torrents of abuse. But overall there has been some progress. But it can be a very slow business.
David Kynaston, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. David Kynaston, author of the recently published On the Cusp, Days of 62. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Pleasure.
A reminder now of our top stories today. A knife-wielding attacker in New Zealand is shot dead by police after stabbing 6 people at a supermarket in Auckland. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern describing the incident as a terrorist attack. And the death toll continues to rise across the east coast of America after flash floods and record-breaking rainfall claim at least 46 lives across 4 states.